There is such an extreme range of opinions when it comes to how MMA fans rank Khabib Nurmagomedov of all time. You have some fans that will claim he is the greatest fighter of all time, he is the GOAT. You have other fans that don't even have him in their top 10 fighters of all time. And I could squint and see an argument for Khabib to be the GOAT, right? I don't agree with it, but if you're someone who really values peak, values dominance over the longevity of some of these longer reigning champions, then I could potentially understand the argument. But after Ilia Topuria's win at UFC 317, I no longer think Khabib even has a case to be the greatest fighter of all time, because if you are someone who values the undefeated fighter without a ton of longevity, but a super high peak, dominant performances against high level competition, I think Ilia has already surpassed Khabib when it comes to an all-time fighter list. And so in this video, I'm going to be breaking down why I think Ilia is higher on the GOAT list than a guy like Khabib. And so we have to go through and compare these guys' resumes. We'll start off with Khabib here, an overall record of 29-0, a UFC record of 13-0. He has 4 title wins, and then his best overall wins are submission wins against Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje, and then the champion in one weight class at lightweight. Then for Ilia, he has a 17-0 pro record, a UFC record of 9-0, 3 title wins, so 1 fewer than Khabib, and then his best wins are knockouts against Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, and Charles Oliveira, and then he has been a champion in 2 different weight classes, featherweight and lightweight. And I think when we look at the quality of competition, especially the elite high-level comp, the guys they're taking on in title fights, I do think Ilia has faced the tougher strength of schedule while also being more dominant against those opponents. You look at this last 3-fight win streak here for Ilia. He knocked out the featherweight GOAT, the only man to ever beat Volkanovski at 145. Then he knocked out, I think, a top 3 featherweight of all time in Max Holloway. And I do think some people are going to try to push the narrative that potentially these are all guys out of their primes. And I'm not going to say it's ideal that he KO'd Volk right after Islam KO'd him, but that punch he landed knocks out literally any version of Volk, probably any man that's ever, weighed in 145 pounds. And then for Max Holloway, I just can't buy that take. I've seen it, from some people out there, but Max Holloway just had an extremely impressive win up a weight class against Justin Gaethje and had consistently been beating every, non-Volkanovski 145er. And then for Charles Oliveira, he moves up to 155 and KOs a top 3, probably at worst, top 4 lightweight of all time. And he did it within the first 3 rounds in all 3 fights. So Volk, round 2 KO, Max Holloway, round 3, Oliveira, he gets it done in the first round. And in those 3 fights against 3 all-time great fighters, he only lost 1 singular round, and that was the first round against Alexander Volkanovski. Now, I'm not going to be criticizing Khabib's strength of schedule here. I think title wins against McGregor, Poirier, Gaethje is very, very tough competition. But I feel like when you're looking at the overall win quality here and trying to kind of figure out where do these guys rank as all-time lightweights? McGregor's probably the best win, but if you really want to nitpick the Volkanovski guys and their previous opponents, then you have to acknowledge that McGregor had been away from the sport. And in terms of his overall resume at 155, obviously he won the belt, but I believe that's his only win he has in the UFC at 155. And then I think Poirier is probably the best win, but that's the 5th best lightweight of all time behind Khabib, Islam, Charles, and then BJ Penn. I don't really know if you can make a case for Poirier above any of those dudes. And so is that the best win there? I don't think the quality of competition is the same as Ilia. And then also Khabib was a super dominant champion. With those 3 opponents, he lost 2 rounds to those guys, whereas Ilia only lost 1 in his, 3-fight win streak. Ilia Topuria also has the edge in the fact that he was a 2-weight world champion, something Khabib wasn't and, never even went for in his time in the UFC. And now I think where people could potentially point to Khabib in this argument is that they're going to point to the overall record, including the pro record and then also within the UFC, because Khabib has 12 more wins overall, and then he also has 4 more wins in the UFC. And to be completely honest, I don't really care, and maybe you think that's bad that I don't care about that, but pre-UFC record in my opinion means very, very little, because he fought 8 more times outside the UFC compared to Ilia. So Am I going to ding Ilia for not beating up on bad competition before he got to the UFC? Like, Khabib went 16-0 on the regional scene. His opponents had a combined record of 65-48. Ilia went 8-0, had half the fights against probably tougher competition. His opponents had a combined record of 24-8. And now I'm not someone who's going to like hardcore criticize Khabib for like the weak strength of schedule pre-UFC. I know there are people that are going to nitpick it and they say, oh, like the record of this guy versus this guy through the first X number of fights. And obviously Khabib's record looks terrible because he was fighting a bunch of no names with poor records on the regional scene. I don't hold that against him. I think you do what you got to do to get into the UFC, but I'm also not going to let that be used as like a stat padding metric where sure, Ilia could have fought a bunch of dudes with an 0-0 record, but like, does that really change anything on how great these guys are in the long run? And just to like put it into perspective, Khabib's 15th win as a pro, so the fight that made him 15-0 was against someone who was making their MMA debut. They had an 0-0 record. In Ilia's 15th pro fight, he was knocking out Alexander Volkanovski for the belt. So like all that regional stuff, I'm just not going to have that used as like, you know, a stat padding metric. And then you could point to like 4 more wins within the UFC. But it really just comes down to the fact that like Khabib had some inactivity issues, some health issues, some cancellations. And so he needed more fights to get to the belt, where he had 9 fights before the title in like a little over 6 years in the UFC. Ilia fought 6 times to get to the title in like 3.5 years. And so once again, like I'm not willing to say that Khabib beating a Michael Johnson and like a Daryl Horcher is going to be the difference between these two, like, you know, in the long run and their overall legacy. Like, are we going to ding Ilia Topuria for not having a win against like a Dan Ige-esque guy? Like, personally, I'm not. And so I do think that Ilia has passed Khabib. I think anything you point to about the pro record, the UFC record, in my opinion, when we're looking at the biggest, you know, the most notable fights, the toughest competition, the title matchups, Ilia faced the tougher competition, and he beat all-time greats, or at least an all-time great, in 2 different weight classes, 145 and 155, arguably like the 2 best weight classes in the history of the organization. And so I do think Ilia has the edge here. I think this is the greatest 3-fight win streak we have seen in like MMA history. Like really going in there and just dominating 3 all-time greats, finishing all of them. It is insanely impressive, and I don't think anyone has, you know, a 3-fight resume to match him here. And so if you are someone who doesn't care about longevity, you just want that peak, that dominance, I don't see any reason why Khabib would still be your GOAT over Ilia Topuria. And I think you could also make some additional arguments. I don't really care about like how well-rounded someone is. I think like if you're so dominant in one area that you can beat everyone, it doesn't matter. But like I would still give a point to Ilia if we're talking about like the more well-rounded guy. And so I do think you can make the case that if you're just looking at peak and you're like, who is the best fighter of all time? You pick one dude with like a 3-fight range in their career. I think it's fair to say that Ilia Topuria is the best. Now, is he the greatest? Is he going to rack up all those counting numbers? I don't know. I certainly think he could if he wanted to stick around. But like I've talked about, if you do value that peak, you thought Khabib was the GOAT a few weeks ago, I think you have to reconsider, because if those are your values, I think Ilia Topuria has come in, he's pretty much matched what Khabib has done, and then done it even better by doing it in a second weight class. So that's my take. If you agree, let me hear it. If you disagree, you can yell at me down below in the comments. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.